Let's start with what we've seen at the moment, which is a lot of talk about Syria. Given the defeat of, so-called, the Islamic State, so-called, and the collapse of the caliphate, President Trump saying it had been defeated 100% a few days ago. Can you talk about the moments leading up to and the vote to bomb ISIS targets in Iraq and Syria that you were there for? You were Defence Secretary for that moment.
Yes, just 2 or 3 weeks before I became Defence Secretary, the caliphate was proclaimed. Officially, that was the start of it. And in military terms, it was desperate. It was a desperate situation. ISIS-Daesh had got to almost the gates of Baghdad. I think Baghdad was down to its last 8 or 9 tanks. It had routed the Iraqi army. And there was a very real prospect of this terrorist movement actually having control of 2 capitals, of both Damascus and Baghdad.
Did you discuss that at cabinet level with the Prime Minister?
Absolutely. In the National Security Council, we had to decide how to react. And it was that summer and autumn we worked on a coalition response, building a coalition. It obviously had to be international. It couldn't just be Britain and couldn't just be Britain and America. It was important to make it international. It was important to engage other Arab countries too. And that wasn't too hard. They were fearful that if this terrorist thing got out of hand, they could be next in line. And it was also vital that it was legitimate. And it was legitimate because the government of Iraq asked us for help.
Were you concerned, though, given that the vote in 2013 hadn't gone the way the government wanted it to? Were you concerned that you had to get the arguments right in order to win that vote?
Absolutely. I thought it was essential that we not only secured parliamentary backing, but that we managed to, if we could, to maintain it throughout the period of engagement. Because once you lose political support for an intervention like this, then I think you're in trouble. And we remember the criticism of the Second Gulf War, Tony Blair's intervention in March 2003, but also later criticism of David Cameron's intervention in Libya. So it was essential that we had proper political support for it. And we went to Parliament at the end of August and we explained that this was going to be a different kind of intervention. We were not going to commit British troops to fight on the ground. The fighting would have to be done by local forces, by the Iraqi army and Kurdish fighters, but we would be offering support from the air, particularly what we could offer best, which was air support, and that would involve airstrikes.
Did you think that you ran the risk of losing that vote, or was it pretty clear pretty early on that there were going to be a majority of MPs supporting it?
Well, that summer we had British hostages beheaded. People could see the atrocities being committed by these people, throwing gays off building, burning people to death. The downed Jordanian pilots were put in a cage and burnt to death. People could see what a vile organisation we were dealing with. We were very conscious from the start that we had to have political support for this campaign and maintain it. Now, we had the advantage that people could see how vile this organisation was. We had British hostages being beheaded. We had a downed Jordanian pilot being put in a cage and set on fire. We had atrocities being committed, gays thrown off building, women being raped and mutilated, all sorts of awful things going on, which people could see very visually. However, the shadow of the 2013 vote the year before in Syria did hang over us. But of course, we were also presenting a new type of campaign. We were saying we're not going to commit British troops on the ground to do the fighting. What we are going to do is to help the Iraqi forces regain their own country.
And there was no discussion of committing British troops, if it were necessary, and only in extremis, to fighting ISIL on the ground in the region. You ruled that out categorically, did you, even behind closed doors?
Yes, that was not an option that was seriously considered.
The Prime Minister said no.
Well, first of all, the Iraqi government didn't ask specifically for British troops. What they wanted when I went to Baghdad and I was confronted with all these rather defeatist generals. What they wanted was equipment, and they wanted help with training. They did not ask specifically for us to get engaged, and neither we nor the Americans wanted to get engaged. What we did want to do was build as wide a possible a coalition internationally, and to help where we thought we could help best, which was to use our airplanes to strike in support of the forces on the ground.
You've talked about the legitimacy, getting the legitimacy for these strikes, bringing Parliament with you in that. I wonder what it would have done, or what you think it would have done, for Britain being seen in the world as a genuine military power, as a reliable ally, if that vote had been lost.
Well, I think it would have been disastrous to our reputation, because what we were responding to was a call for help under the United Nations articles. The Iraqi government had asked us to help in their defence. That's quite different to what was happening with Assad and his chemical weapons in Syria, or even different to what was happening in Libya. Here we had a democratic country asking for our assistance, and if Britain had been one of the only nations, to refuse that assistance, I think that would have been very, very damaging to our reputation.
We're seeing arguably the effects of the British campaign, along with allies, to defeat ISIS, in that we're getting now a number of British people popping up having gone out to join ISIS. You've said before that British ISIL recruits are a legitimate target, and that they, quote, run the risk every hour, every day of being on the wrong end of an RAF or a United States missile. Do you think Shamima Begum was a legitimate target, a legitimate target?
Well, we don't know that, and we're not privy to the information that the Home Secretary and the security services have about her, the extent to which she was actually involved. Clearly, if you're fighting for a terrorist organisation, or if you're materially aiding and abetting a terrorist organisation, then yes, you are part of it. You are a legitimate target, and you may well be involved with people who are preparing terrorist acts in Western Europe.
Do you see aiding and abetting as joining and supporting and arguably having the children of members of the caliphate?
Well, that's, you'd have to ask a lawyer exactly what the distinction was. But offering support to an organisation that was material to its to securing its objectives clearly is aiding and abetting. But we can't discuss an individual case because we don't have the information that the Home Secretary has when he took his decision.
Do you think it's right that his decision has been made to keep her out of the country?
Yes, I do. And, I've no reason to doubt.
Regardless of the questions about citizenship.
I've no reason to doubt his judgment in this particular case.
What do you think the policy should be towards returning British fighters? I mean, Shamima Begum, again, says that she wasn't involved in the fighting. We don't have the rest of the information that the Home Secretary will be looking at. But in terms of the British citizens who will be coming back, looking to come back, what do you think the policy should be towards them?
Well, the policy there is very clear that if there is evidence, then they should be charged, and then they should be prosecuted.
In country or in Britain?
Well, if at all possible, in Britain, if that can be done, and we've tightened up the law recently. Country,
you would want to see, though, wouldn't you, the possibility of citizenship being suspended for a British person who had gone out and shot weapons for, beheaded people in the name of ISIS?
Yes, but suspending citizenship has to be done in a legal way. You have to be careful how you exercise that particular power.
Do you think there should be greater legal power to do that for sole British citizens, regardless of dual national?
Well, there is, I think, internationally a presumption against making people stateless, so that might be more difficult. What I think we will have to consider, because there will be other terrorist conflicts like this, we will have to consider some form of international terrorist court. Now, the United States doesn't recognise the International Criminal Court, so we may need a new specialist court that can, on behalf of countries where it is more difficult for them to charge and try terrorists, that can be done internationally. And that's something I've pursued with Senator Lindsey Graham, for example, in the United States, who's also concerned about this. Everybody wants to avoid us ending up with some kind of Guantanamo camp where people of different nationalities are sort of thrown into some jail without the prospect of being formally charged, either in their own country or in the United States.
So you're looking at another body being set up to prosecute terrorists specifically in the country, but subject to international law.
Or internationally, if they can be handed over, as international criminals are to The Hague. Because I think this situation is going to recur and recur, and I think we need better machinery to do it. At the moment, different countries are taking different decisions. I think France is prepared to accept children back, but not adults. So it's being handled in different ways.
You've talked about the shadow of the vote that was lost to bomb Assad in Syria. We talk endlessly about the shadow cast by the Iraq conflict, which has just been enormous. You've said that the defeat of ISIL shows what good intervention may look like. Do you think the public should be more accepting of the need for targeted military intervention overseas like this?
Yes, and I hope, that the shadow of the Syria vote and the Iraq war, those shadows have now been lifted. We have, one of the most sophisticated militaries in the world, the fifth or sixth biggest military budget, some very impressive technology and some very skilled pilots and soldiers and navy. And, when a democracy asks you for help, it would be very odd, I think, for Britain to simply stand aside when you have the power and the ability to help somebody in their self-defence. I don't think it's right for us to stand aside. And there are some very fragile democracies that we've been helping ever since. Now, we've not gone into fighting, but we have substantial military training operations now in Ukraine, in Nigeria, still in Afghanistan. In each case, helping fragile democracies who've asked for help in their own self-defence against insurgency. And I think the public does understand that when a democracy calls for help, then it's quite legitimate for Britain to answer the call.
One of the tools at your disposal in that help that doesn't or didn't need parliamentary approval in individual cases was the use of drones in Iraq and Syria. I wonder if you could talk us through the process of deciding to use a drone strike. How are you confronted with the information? What's the time frame in which you have to make the decision? Take us into the room where you decide.
Well, first of all, we use drone strikes in the normal course of military operations. We use drones in support of ground forces. But I think what you may be referring to is some very specialist situations where we were confronted with somebody planning terrorist operations in the UK or directly ordering them or ordering them in Western Europe, and where you have information like that and where there is no other way of stopping the terrorist, because you might lose him if he crosses the border into Turkey. If you have no other way of stopping him, then you have to consider military action, and that's what we did.
And what information are you given? You're met by what, a general or a commander who says, Secretary of State, we need your decision here, looking at the information that's presented to you, the timeframes, the area that they're in order to minimise civilian casualties?
Well, here you have a responsibility not to the self-defence of Iraq, but to the self-defence of Britain, and indeed your allies in Western Europe. And if you have a piece of information that intimates that somebody is planning imminently a terrorist attack against the United Kingdom or one of your key allies, France, say, then you're certainly duty-bound to do something about it if you can. And that is, of course, why, with the help of the security services and our intelligence operations, that's why we took very great trouble to try and ensure that any such attacks were forestalled, and where we could identify people that were likely to carry them out in a few very limited circumstances, yes, we would take preventative action.
What tactics did ISIL use to try and avoid those strikes?
Well, they were very careful to move their people around very frequently, always sleeping. Their key terrorist organisers were always sleeping in different houses every night. And in some of the cities we were watching from the air, they put tarpaulins over the main streets, so it was more difficult for our drones to actually see them physically in the street. So they were very conscious of the techniques that our people were using. And it became, a war of technologies. They were conscious that, of course, their use of phones and internet could be vulnerable, and our people had to keep devising steps to keep ahead of them.
Extraordinary that you clearly can't talk about it, but the intelligence, the human intelligence that must have gone into getting the information to provide you with the ability to say, yes, let's do that now.
Well, we don't talk about the sources of the intelligence, and that comes from various people, and not just various people, but from various systems, and from our allies as well. And, we don't discuss that in public because obviously it would compromise future operations. But in the end, if somebody is planning an attack on British soil or on the soil of our allies, and we had reasonable evidence that it was imminent and there was no other way of dealing with it, in the end, you had to consider military action. And
you don't think Parliament needed to be taken with you on that?
No, I think in those cases, Parliament, we made it very clear that we would explain to Parliament afterwards, and David Cameron and I did that, in fact, in August 15, I think a year later, where we acknowledged that drones had been used to tackle two particular terrorists. And we reported to Parliament afterwards. But it's not practical in these situations where you may only have a matter of hours or sometimes even less where a target presents itself in order to prevent a particular attack. There's very little time, and it's not possible for Parliament to be consulted. But you should be accountable, to Parliament afterwards within the limits of the normal criteria so far as intelligence is concerned.
Just finally on this, the wider point here about military intervention overseas. The Prime Minister said, I think in 2016, that, quote, the days of Britain and America intervening in sovereign countries in an attempt to remake the world in our own image are over. Do you think she was right to say that?
Yes, because these were interventions sometimes designed to change a country's regime, to force Western systems upon them. And I think what we've now established is a better model, that we wait for a country to specifically ask for help, and if that is a democracy and they want our help to preserve a democracy, then where we can, we should intervene. But it should always be legitimate within the rules of the United Nations, and and almost always in concert with allies. And that's why it was very important that it was not just Britain and Iraq putting soldiers into Iraq to train, but it was a whole host of other countries as well. And there was support from Arab countries too.
You talk about allies. Let's move on to talk about the US for a bit and what we saw over the last few weeks, Trump's summit with Kim Jong-un in North Korea, seemingly ending in failure, in that there were no sort of further plans to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula. Although it's fair to say, I think a lot of people are quite pleased that we're some way away from the tweets about fire and fury and all the rest of it. You had a good relationship with General Mattis, the US Defense Secretary. How close to war with North Korea do you think the US actually got?
I don't think they got close to war, but there was a huge impatience, certainly on the part of the new president, when he was confronted with what he called the rocket man, I think, with these missile tests. And of course, he was putting missiles over the sea of Japan, threatening one of the United States' key allies, Japan, but also threatening United States personnel in their bases in Japan. So it was seen in Washington as very much a very direct threat, and something they wanted to do something about.
Did you ever get the sense that they would take direct action on that threat?
Not direct action, but of course they wanted sanctions stepped up. They wanted the sanctions that were already in place properly enforced in terms of an embargo, and they were certainly prepared to come to the defence of South Korea.
Do you think that there remains the threat of, if not war, whatever how that is defined, but certainly military action from the US into North Korea, or from North Korea into South Korea?
Well, it's a very unstable place if you go there, and certainly if you go up to the demilitarized zone, it feels incredibly unstable. and it's a militarized peninsula. The war is not formally ended between North and South Korea. You feel you're in the middle of two armed camps. There's a very heavy US presence, obviously, in South Korea. So it feels a very dangerous situation, and of course it is. As he's developing missiles with longer and longer reach, it's a threat to all of us. A missile that can reach Los Angeles can also reach London, so it's a threat to all of us.
And are you hopeful then that the US president can get something out of Kim Jong-un that would see them denuclearise?
Well, it was described as a failure for President Trump, but of course it's also a failure for Kim and North Korea because they wanted the sanctions lifted. And they do need the sanctions lifted. They're really now having an effect on the quality of life in North Korea, which is already pretty grim. So it's a failure from their point of view. And, I hope they will return to talk.
Just on the points about nuclear weapons, can you put to bed a myth about the UK's nuclear capability? There are people who say that we would need to ask the US's permission in order to launch a nuclear weapon. Is that true?
No, the deterrent is absolutely independent. And the line of command, the chain of command, starts with the Prime Minister, who does not require permission from the American President or anybody else. And
we have an entirely sovereign,
and all the way down to the missiles store, where we are free, and I've been there. We are free to choose the warheads that we want from the warehouse, if you like. So any idea that they could be programmed or somehow remain under US control is nonsense. No, the deterrent has to be independent.
Can you shed any light on that chain of command? You said it's the Prime Minister's decision, and he writes the letter of last resort and all the rest of it. Who would have made the call to you? What would your involvement have been in that process were it to have happened?
Well, the use of nuclear weapons is a matter for the Prime Minister in the end, but then the chain of command comes into effect, and the order would be passed over to us in defence, and we would then have to exercise it and make sure it reaches the commanders of the submarines and so on. And then we have the broader responsibility of making sure the whole machinery works, that it's tested all the time so that any order from the Prime Minister gets directly through. These systems are tested repeatedly. And it's also
regularly?
Well, I'm not going to go into the details. I'm sorry, you're trying hard, but I'm not going to go into the details of that. And it's also, of course, the Ministry of Defence's responsibility to make sure that we update the deterrent in due course. The Trident missile will need to be replaced, and to take the decision on replacing the boats, which we have taken back in the summer of 2016. A lot of money to set aside to build 4 new nuclear submarines. But this is a deterrent that is being prepared for the years 2030 to 2060. For that 30-year period, because it takes 13, 14 years to build a boat. And the calculation in Cabinet and in Parliament actually came down to this. If you can be sure there'll be no nuclear threat to Britain during those 30 years, 2030 to 2060, fine, then dispense with a deterrent. If you can't be sure, and there are 12,000 nuclear weapons out there, and you've got the Rocket Man and others building them, if you can't be sure that 30-year period there will be no nuclear threat to Britain, then you've got to go ahead and prepare. And that's what we've done in building now the 4 Dreadnought submarines that will replace the Vanguards.
So in arguing against spending that money, a lot of money, I think it's 60 billion?
No, it's not as much as 60 billion, but it's more than that.
It's a lot of billions.
I used to have all these figures at my fingertips when I was.
But in arguing against spending however many billions of pounds it would cost, you think that it's a ridiculous argument. It's an argument that puts the country at risk.
It does, and the deterrent. People make the mistake of saying, "Well, it's not going to be used." The deterrent is used every day. It's used every hour of every day. It's permanent. It's there, and what it does is make anybody who is thinking of threatening this country think twice, because they cannot know exactly how we would respond, and we have the power to respond. It puts doubt into the minds of your adversaries, and that is the point of the deterrent. It's a political weapon as much as a military weapon.
So if in the circumstances that Sir Michael Fallon were asked to write a letter of last resort, what would you write?
Well, the letter of last resort is to tell the commanders what to do in the event of a nuclear attack that has happened. It's not the instruction to fire. It's to tell them what to do if the command centres in Britain have been wiped out. And what previous Prime Ministers, I think, have done is advise them to, as much as they can, to get in touch with other allied navies.
So the US would be involved in a sense, but not directly in taking the decision.
Well, yes, if Britain had, if London, heaven forsake, heaven forbid, had been wiped out, then you would expect the nuclear commanders, to head for another allied navy.
That's quite a sort of conventional, if that's the right word to use about a nuclear apocalypse, view of what it would be like, that kind of kinetic activity. I wonder in 2030 to 2060 whether we'll actually be talking more about cyber warfare and the warfare that is committed that way. How much of a military threat to the UK are countries like China, who definitely attack us in that manner all the time? How much of a threat is that to the UK, and how much of a threat will that be in 2030 to 2060?
Well, it's a growing threat. We recognised it in the 2015 Defence Review. There are cyber weapons being developed by other countries, not just China, but by other countries, notably
North Korea, Iran,
Russia, who are developing these weapons that can be used in the battle space, but of course can also be used to destabilise countries, to attack their critical national infrastructure, or take down commercial operations. And we've had attacks here already on our health service, on our parliament, on our banks, on key institutions. So we have to respond to that, and we are. We're spending a lot more on cyber defence now, and of course we're also developing our own cyber weapons because we have to understand those, and we were able to use those for the first time in the campaign against ISIL-Daesh in Iraq.
Yes, I saw that. You wrote about the offensive cyber that was being used against ISIS. Who's in charge of UK cyber policy? Who draws up the rules for it, or what our response is going to be to any individual attack?
Well, the government is in charge overall, the Prime Minister.
But is it a defence issue? Is it a Home Affairs issue?
Where the use of cyber is offensive, then it's a defence issue. Right. It's a matter for the Secretary of State for Defence. Obviously, defence, cyber defence covers other areas as well, including the Home Office, the Cabinet Office, and indeed the Foreign Office.
Again, we talk about rules of engagement with drone strikes and other use of weapons. Are there rules of engagement that you would insist on around an offensive cyber attack? You wouldn't, for instance, knock out the electricity of an entire city so that people's lives, civilian lives, were affected by it. A hospital, for instance, that was knocked offline.
Absolutely not. We had rules of engagement for all this sort of thing. We had rules of engagement for the Iraq campaign. We had no strike lists, for example, that we did not strike certain things. Hospitals, a very good example, schools, mosques, and so on. And we took every precaution with our own strikes, with our own RAF strikes, to minimise any risk of civilian casualties from those strikes.
But even with it's interesting to work out how you could control that. If a state-sponsored but not state actor were to not engage with the rules around the use of cyber warfare and to knock out a city in the UK's power grid, how would the United Kingdom respond in kind to a non-state actor who is doing it from a bedroom somewhere?
Well, you're asking, hypothetical questions here, Tom. But let me assure you, all those eventualities, are worked through as part of our defence, and we have built cyber defence into all four of our commands, into the Navy, the Army, the Air Force, and Joint Forces Command. It's not a separate structure. We've built cyber defence into those existing force structures.
On China specifically, I wonder what you make of their Belt and Road Initiative, this policy of expansion across the Near East and into Africa. And people have been upset about the lack of transparency and the lack of following of the international rules-based system. Do you think David Cameron and George Osborne were too quick to court China in economic terms? And would that have an effect on defence policy?
Well, I think you have to take care, and we did take care. I mean, China is becoming a very important investor in this country. There's plenty of straightforward commercial investment by Chinese companies, and of course they're financing the new nuclear power station that's being built down in Somerset. So
a lot of people worried about that.
A lot of people were worried about it, and the current Prime Minister had a good look at it when she came into office. She paused it to have another look at whether there were security implications.
Were you raising concerns about it?
Well, of course, it wasn't a Chinese system. What the Chinese were doing was providing the finance for a French system. What the Chinese want to do is to start designing their own system inside British power stations, and that will obviously require further scrutiny. But look, China is a massively growing economy. It's a very important market for us. So, we have to trade with China, but of course you have to beware, as you would with any large country, that we've had a difficult relationship in the past. China is becoming more international and is now joining these international organisations, and we've got to make sure that they understand the importance of the rules-based system internationally.
So are we leading them to do that, or are they leading us because they're such an economic powerhouse, because they're going to be the #1 economy in the world and stay there for potentially some time?
In my time, we were trying to encourage them to see that it was in their own self-interest actually to follow the international rules-based system, because one day they would need it. They would need its help, its protection, its advantages. And a good example of that is the South China Sea. There is a law of the sea convention as to how you claim disputed territories, with a court in The Hague that rules on this stuff. And we were trying to make sure that China understood that one day it too, in some other part of the world, as it develops its ambition and its blue water navy, might want to rely on the law of the sea convention.
You talk about the South China Sea. Your successor, Gavin Williamson, said the UK was prepared to use lethal force to deter countries that flout international law. In apparent reference to Chinese expansion, he sent our aircraft carrier to the South China Sea. We've talked about the difficulty in encouraging China, being wary of China. Do you think that's the right approach from the UK's point of view?
Well, it's very important that South China Sea is kept open. It's an international waterway. We would be in all sorts of trouble here if we closed the Dover Straits, the English Channel. We had a Russian aircraft carrier coming through it, if you remember. So the South China Sea is an international waterway, and it's very important that we maintain the freedom to navigate through it. That is slightly different, of course, to anybody, the Americans or indeed us, sending in ships that start to conduct exercises and aircraft activity and naval exercises and all the rest of it on the way, if you like. So I think we've got to be extremely careful about any engagement of that sort. I sent RAF Typhoons through the South China Sea in, I think it was October 15, on their way to do the first ever joint exercise with Japan. And they had to fly through the South China Sea. It was the only way to get to Japan. We didn't require China's permission, but we did, as a matter of courtesy, notify them.
What did they say?
There would be aircraft flying through, and they didn't formally assent to it, but they understood that it was going to happen, and it did happen, and that was done without too much fuss. And subsequently, of course, we've had a couple of Royal Navy ships that have gone through the South China Sea. But these are things that just need to be done with very great care.
Do you think enough care has been shown in this decision?
Well, we haven't seen what the plans are yet for.
The Chinese aren't very happy.
Well, we haven't seen what the plans are for the first deployment of the aircraft carrier, and I think it was the Chancellor that reminded everybody that decision on its first deployment, of course, will be taken by the National Security Council, which comprises all the senior ministers, so everybody will be able to give their own particular advice.
We've got the point, thank you. Coming back home then, away from far-flung places around the world, do you think we make the most of troops in this country? That they aren't just training in their barracks, they're actually doing something with that training? Could you see them playing a bigger role, for instance, in helping the police or in helping in prisons?
Well, they were operating in my time around the world in over 20 different countries, some very small operations, but increasingly being drawn into peacekeeping and anti-terrorist training in countries in Africa, where we have a very strong interest. If those countries become failed states, then Europe and perhaps Britain, in the end, has to pick up the additional migration or perhaps the flow of terrorists and drugs and whatever across the Mediterranean. So, there was plenty for the army to do around the world. But I think you saw during the terrorist attacks that we did have, I think you saw something we didn't perhaps foresee and we were nervous about. We saw a very good public reaction when troops were deployed. There's always historically, I think, shades of Peterloo, there's been historically some reservation about having troops on the streets of Britain. But I think people could see that they were there to help augment the armed police officers who were doing the principal work, and they were welcomed.
I remember that because that was when the threat level was raised, of course, after the terror attacks around, I think it was Parsons Green and other events in London, Westminster as well, where the threat level was raised, and so the troops replaced the police officers who then went out on further duties. We look in London at the moment and around cities in the country right now, people are worried about police numbers, they're worried about a rise in violent crime. Do you see any role whatsoever for troops to play in keeping streets safe when it comes to things like knife crime, not just terrorism? Well,
the police the armed forces are there to back up the police, and that was their role during the terrorist times. They were there not to patrol, actually, they were there to guard, and that was releasing armed police officers to get on and do their other work.
Would you be happy to see the army do that again if it were required? If whoever, City Khan or the Prime Minister, whoever thought it was required in order to make the streets safe again for people?
I don't see them doing that, actually making streets safe. But they're always there in support of the civil power. If troops are required to, for example, to be involved in large-scale searching of woods or cordoning off railway stations or whatever, local police commanders know in the end that if they need numbers of trained people and they haven't got enough police officers, they can rely on the military to help and call on them.
So it could be an option.
Well, I'm wary of what you're suggesting, which is they actually replace.
No, sorry, maybe I'm not explaining it.
Their work.
You could do what happened during the threat level raising of armed police being replaced by soldiers there guarding big institutions like Downing Street, Westminster, nuclear power stations,
and power stations, and the rest of it.
But that requires a level of the terror threat to be raised, which is quite a serious thing. People don't feel safe right now. There's a lot of violent crime on the streets that we're seeing, knife crime and all the rest of it. Do you think it would be a legitimate option to take to say, well, let's bring the troops into guard and free up more police officers to go out and try and control the streets?
Well, I'm not qualified to judge that as to how short the police forces really feel they are of manpower and whether or not they have enough. They have been training more armed officers now. But I think we need to be very careful about, conflating the two roles. In the end, it is the local police, armed or otherwise, who have that responsibility.
Were there any moments in your career as Defence Secretary where you thought the resources of the British military could have been used better in this country on various events or various moments?
Well, we did use them during the electricity problems we had during the really bad weather that took out a lot of electricity. Troops were deployed fairly successfully to try and restore power. We used them during the floods, and I think a lot of the northern cities were very grateful to see troops coming to help them. They're trained, they're professional. There are a number of backup training schemes in the event of disruption, for example, to oil terminals or to the fire service, where troops are ready because these are services that are essential to daily life. So there are a number of areas where troops are constantly trained in rotation to be ready to step in.
You mentioned floods and other moments of sort of national difficulty. I wonder whether Grenfell plays into that at all. I mean, there were discussions certainly between officials in Number 10 at the time about whether or not the military could be drafted in a logistical capacity.
Yes, and I felt that quite strongly because it was clear, perhaps it wasn't clear in the first day or so, but it was clear that that council couldn't actually cope, and probably no council could have coped. My own council back in Sevenoaks probably couldn't have coped with the enormity of what was happening. And I was very struck by a remark somebody made, one of the local community or one of the survivors who saw these piles of clothing that had been donated and a lot of people sort of milling around. And one of those survivors said, where were the troops? And one of the journalists asked, what do you mean? They said, well, they sent troops when there were floods and when the farmers were in trouble over mad cow disease, there were troops. Why aren't the troops here helping us? Which in a way I think is the most enormous tribute to our armed forces that, people would have expected that kind of highly professional help. And in retrospect, had I been Prime Minister, I would have sent a general in there straight away to take over.
To organise better. To
organise the whole thing much better from that final morning after the fire was put out. Because it was in those early hours, I think, people lost confidence in the state and the state's ability to actually bring practical help to those who need it. And that's not a reflection on the council officials. Probably, any council would have struggled in those circumstances.
But those are the kind of area. I mean, again, God forbid we ever see anything like that happen again in this country. But for moments of national emergency, which, I think a lot of people felt that was, more use could be made of the power of British troops, the logistics capabilities, the organisational capabilities. That should be a way forward now.
Yes, it's one of the things David Cameron started to change, because in the old days that entirely relied on the chief executive of a council saying, look, I can't cope anymore, and calling in the military. And of course, or indeed the boss of the power station or whatever, wherever it was. And of course, people are very reluctant to do that. You're kind of admitting failure, that you can't cope anymore, and you're asking for the military to come in. And David Cameron insisted that the people on the spot really have to be pushed to consider help, to ask for it earlier, and be told what help is actually available. And in COBRA meetings, the COBRA Emergency Committee, as well as the chief executive, we would have the Gold Police Commander on, and hear from him or her exactly how bad the situation was, in order to ensure that the local civilian administrator, realised that there were resources there, that probably he or she was struggling.
Is it a moment of regret for you in your time as Defence Secretary that those troops weren't there?
Well, they were, at Grenfell, I think they could certainly have helped in the early days, because they're good at logistics. Yeah. They're good at distribution. They're good at establishing order. And I think when you have a seismic event like that, people will respond partly to uniform, but also to a clear-eyed senior army officer who looks as if he knows what he's doing, rather than a fairly worried, hapless council official. And I think people will respond to that, to the chain of command. But, we have a civilian structure here, and obviously it was up to the council in those circumstances to respond. But it's interesting that in recent years we've seen troops deployed to deal with power cuts, to deal with floods, to deal with the BSE back in the early years of this century. We are seeing troops being used more and more often.
In all that you've described about the relationships you've had to have with people around the world, the decisions you've had to take to use weapons overseas and on various targets that could threaten this country, I wonder if there was ever a moment in that time where you felt scared, might be the wrong word, you don't seem like a man who gets scared, but unnerved or unsettled by some of the decisions you were having to take.
Well, you have very good advice, and you're dealing with highly competent people who've been in these situations before, senior officers who've served in Iraq and Afghanistan. So, there's plenty of good judgment around that you can rely on. But in the end, some of these decisions, particularly those involving certain strikes, and we haven't got into detail on that, but some of those decisions in the end are decisions that only a Secretary of State can take or should take. Some, of course, are referred to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister's informed or consulted. But there are decisions that you have to take, and I think the key is to take them, is not to try and put them off and ask endlessly for other meetings, is to weigh up the advice you've been given, particularly from those who've been in these countries, who've served in these situations, to weigh up the advice that you're given, and then not to mess around too much, but to get on and take the decision and let them do what they have to do.
Did it ever affect you?
Oh, you think about these things, of course, but you also have to think of the armed forces themselves.
Yeah.
We were sending very young men and women flying jets at night over potentially hostile airspace, night after night, from our air bases in Cyprus. You have to think, your duty to keep them safe as well as keep your country safe, and not to place them in situations of danger. And that's why we were very careful in our deployments on the ground, not to let our troops who were doing the training get too far forward that they would end up being drawn into the fight. And when you're in campaigns like this, there are endless revisions of not just the rules of engagement, but of the permissions as to exactly what British troops are able to do. For example, if they're in a camp in Iraq, training Iraqi army, and there's an attack on the camp, they've obviously got to be allowed to defend themselves with their weapons. So, these are things that, you do think about the whole time.
Keep you awake at night.
Yes, I mean, a lot of these things did happen at night. The American strike on the final strike on the chemical weapons that our Parliament had refused in 13 was finally carried out in the spring of 16, and that involved phone calls from Secretary Mattis in the middle of the night, because it was all a different time zone. But a lot of these campaigns and the key parts in these campaigns are at night.
I wonder then, just finally, on the bigger picture, you mentioned earlier about forward-thinking 2030, 2060 planning. I wonder what you see as the biggest threat to Britain right now, or the country, or the leader that poses the biggest question to Britain and its role in the world militarily.
I was always being asked how I ranked threats. Was Russia more of a threat than the Daesh ISIL terrorists in the Middle East? Was China more of a threat than Iran? I don't think it's always possible to rank them. We tried in the Defence Review in 15, and we said, yes, Russia is clearly a threat. Cyber is clearly a threat. Terrorism is a threat. And there are other hostile states. We have to deal with all of these things, and you do require a mixture of forces, and you do have to keep your eye on changing technology. Back in 2010, we didn't think so much about ballistic missiles, for example, how you defend against them. Now we do. Cyber was almost unknown back in 2010 at the time of that review. Now it's a key part for all of the armed forces. So, these things change over time, but the biggest threats to this country remain, those states that are hostile to us, principally Russia, who attacked our soil a year ago, Iran, North Korea, and so on, terrorist groups, and then non-state actors who can use cyber. And to use cyber, all you need is a screen and a backpack.
You mentioned Russia just finally. We're talking on the year anniversary since the chemical weapons attack in Salisbury. It is sort of unbelievable that is how it's described, and that even happened. Do you think that the response from Britain and allies around the world to expel Russian intelligence officers, do you think that was enough? Do you think that was commensurate with the damage done, with the harm brought about?
Well, it was essential to see that Russia saw that response and saw it from the allies right across the world. Everybody was able to agreed to throw out intelligence officers from their respective countries. But it also involved continuing the sanctions, that there had been pressure in the European Union to start lifting the sanctions after the invasion of Crimea. Some years had passed. That's been resisted. Those sanctions are still in place. What I felt was really important, of course, was to call out Russia as early as possible, to get the evidence, to get the proof, and say, here it is, here are the photos, here's the CCTV. These were definitely Russian officers of some description or another. They can't have been tourists. And I think we need to do more of that, and we need to do it. Quicker. I used to call it the faster truth. Can I give you perhaps just one closing example? About the second day I was in office, the Russians, Malaysian airliner was shot down over the Ukraine. A civilian airliner, and 10 British citizens were killed, and a lot of Dutch citizens and a lot of Australians and Malaysians. We knew the following day that had been done from a Russian missile launcher. We knew which launcher, and we knew when it had been brought across the border from Russia. It has taken 4 years of patient investigation by the Dutch, who had been doing the investigation, to conclusively prove that, by which time everybody's almost forgotten about the downing of that particular airliner. We've got to be faster at calling out Russia for these things and actually saying, yep, it was you. Here's some proof that it was your people that were involved.
Why didn't we do that?
Well, there are always intelligence reasons for not sharing the intelligence that you have about what's going on in a particular country, because you don't want to disclose how you might have obtained that intelligence. So there can always be good intelligence reasons for not sharing photographs or other kinds of information. But in these particular cases where the crimes are so heinous, where you're having civilians murdered, I always felt that we should be faster at getting the truth out there.